that, ladies and gentlemen, that imagine waking up to find that the medicine keeping your loved one alive has vanished from the shelves. Not because it doesn't exist, but because a decision was made to stop sending it. That India halts life, saving drug exports at a time when the world's dependence on its pharmaceutical industry is at an all-time high. That sending shockwaves through global healthcare systems. That often referred to as the pharmacy of the world. India supplies a significant percentage of generic medicines, vaccines, and critical active pharmaceutical ingredients to countries across every continent. Many of these drugs are not simply convenient alternatives. They are the backbone of treatment for chronic diseases, infections, and life-threatening conditions. For the United States, which relies heavily on imported generics to keep healthcare costs manageable, the sudden halt feels like an emergency without a warning siren. That pharmacies brace for shortages, hospitals worry about depleting inventories, and patients fear the uncertainty of whether they will have uninterrupted access to vital treatments. The move is not just a commercial decision, it's a strategic signal that India is willing to exercise its leverage in the global supply chain. That in a world where medical supply lines are often taken for granted, this action forces other nations to confront the uncomfortable reality of dependence. Many might have assumed that as long as markets were open, that medicines would flow freely across borders. But this step disrupts that assumption entirely. That it reminds the world that access to life-saving drugs is not an absolute guarantee. It is contingent on relationships, agreements, and the political will of the supplier nation. The implications extend beyond economics and into the realm of geopolitics. By halting exports, India underscores its position as a critical player in global health security, capable of influencing outcomes in other nations, not just through diplomacy or trade agreements, but through control over essential resources. For countries like the United States, which have outsourced much of their drug manufacturing due to cost advantages, this disruption serves as a stark wake-up call about the vulnerability of over-reliance on a single source. It also pushes the conversation towards self-reliance, domestic manufacturing, and strategic reserves, ideas that often sit idle until a crisis forces them into action. From India's perspective, the decision can be rooted in multiple motivations, safeguarding domestic supply during a health crisis, responding to international trade tensions, or signaling discontent with certain foreign policies. Whatever the driving factors, the message is unmistakable. Control over something as vital as medicine is as powerful, if not more so, than control over oil or technology. In a world still recovering from the lessons of global pandemics, such a move resonates deeply, stirring both fear and respect among other nations. The halt in exports is more than just a pause in shipments. It is a statement of sovereignty, a demonstration of economic and humanitarian influence, and a reminder that in the delicate balance of global interdependence, the side holding the life-saving keys holds immense power over the rest. A 50% tax increase on critical medicine sends an immediate shockwave through the healthcare and economic systems, hitting both providers and patients with equal force. For consumers, this means that life-saving treatments, which were already a significant financial burden, now become alarmingly more expensive. Hospitals and pharmacies, which rely on steady pricing to maintain stock levels and manage patient care, are suddenly forced to reassess their budgets, often leading to rationing, delays in procurement, or passing the increased costs directly onto patients. That, in situations where the drugs in question are not optional, but essential for survival, such as treatments for cancer, heart disease, or chronic illnesses, the impact is magnified. That people who were just able to afford their medication before may now find themselves having to choose between health and other basic needs. A moral dilemma that underscores the human cost behind financial policies. For the pharmaceutical industry and distributors, that the tax hike disrupts business models and long-term contracts, especially those built on the assumption of stable trade costs. That manufacturers may find themselves squeezed between rising taxes on exports or imports and pressure to keep prices competitive in global markets. That this often leads to reductions in supply or the pursuit of cheaper but potentially less effective alternatives, that creating a ripple effect on the quality and availability of medicine in countries dependent on these drugs. That public health systems may face severe strain with increased patient load, higher mortality rates, and greater demand for emergency care. That the economic burden is not limited to healthcare, it spills over into insurance industries, government subsidy programs, and even workforce productivity as untreated illnesses sideline more people from their jobs. That the political and strategic implications are equally profound. A 50% tax hike on something as sensitive as life, saving medicine can be seen as a form of economic leverage or retaliation in international relations. That it can serve as a tool to send a message, exert pressure, or force renegotiations of trade agreements. That such a move can ignite debates in legislative bodies, fuel public protests, and draw criticism from humanitarian organizations and foreign governments. Nations affected may scramble to seek alternative suppliers, form emergency trade pacts, or even invest heavily in domestic manufacturing to reduce vulnerability to future shocks. From a global perspective, this sudden surge in cost highlights the fragile nature of interdependent supply chains, especially in critical sectors like healthcare. It also exposes how financial measures, often dismissed as technical or bureaucratic, can have immediate and life-altering consequences for millions of people in a competitive geopolitical landscape where economic tools are increasingly used alongside military and diplomatic strategies. A drastic tax increase on life-saving medicines becomes more than a fiscal decision. It becomes a statement of intent, a demonstration of power, and a reminder that in the interconnected world, financial levers can be as decisive as any political decree or physical blockade. The issue goes beyond medicine because at its core, it is not solely about the physical supply of pills and vials, but about the larger forces that determine who gets access to them and at what cost. Medicines, while life-saving, are also commodities that exist within a web of trade agreements, geopolitical strategies, and economic power plays. When a nation halts exports or imposes steep taxes, it is rarely an isolated act driven purely by production constraints or domestic shortages. More often, it reflects broader agendas, from asserting sovereignty and negotiating leverage to responding to perceived injustices in international relations. The act of controlling a resource so vital to survival transforms it into a strategic weapon capable of influencing the behavior and decisions of other countries without a single shot being fired. This goes into the realm of power dynamics where health becomes intertwined with politics. Nations dependent on imports for their healthcare infrastructure suddenly find themselves at the mercy of those controlling the supply. Such dependence can shift the balance of negotiations in unrelated sectors, whether it is technology transfer, defense cooperation, that, or climate agreements. The message is clear. If you want access to what keeps your people alive, you may have to make concessions elsewhere. That this invisible pressure is far more potent than many traditional diplomatic tools because it strikes directly at a population's well-being, that stirring public sentiment and creating internal political pressure on leaders. Economically, the issue extends into global market stability. That when the supply of life-saving medicines is disrupted, the impact ripples into insurance markets, stock prices of healthcare companies, and the investment climate in pharmaceutical manufacturing. Investors and corporations begin to reassess risks, that possibly shifting operations or increasing prices to protect profits. This, in turn, can lead to higher healthcare costs worldwide, that affecting even those countries not directly targeted by export bans or taxes. In such an interconnected world, that the fallout from one nation's policy can be felt in the pharmacies and hospitals of another thousands of miles away. That there is also a humanitarian and ethical dimension that transcends economics and politics. That the withholding of essential medicines raises questions about moral responsibility in global governance. That should access to life-saving treatment ever be used as a bargaining chip? That while international conventions advocate for the free flow of humanitarian goods, the reality is that enforcement is weak, and nations often prioritize strategic advantage over altruism. That this clash between moral ideals and political realities exposes a fundamental flaw in the global system, the lack of a truly independent, universally accepted mechanism to ensure that essential health resources remain accessible in times of conflict or diplomatic tension. Ultimately, the broader context makes it clear that the debate is not just about whether patients will receive their medicines on time, that it is about the nature of global interdependence, the leverage that comes from controlling vital resources, and the blurred lines between humanitarian need and national interest, the drama surrounding medicines is a mirror reflecting much larger truths about the way power, politics, and economics shape the fate of nations. The nations will only be pushed so far before they reach a point where resistance becomes inevitable, and history is full of moments that prove this truth. Every country operates within a delicate balance of cooperation and self-preservation, often making compromises to maintain peace, economic growth, or diplomatic relationships. However, when external pressures, whether economic sanctions, trade restrictions, political interference, or security threats, begin to threaten a nation's core interests, sovereignty, or dignity, patience starts to erode. Leaders and citizens alike come to realize that endless concessions can undermine national identity and future stability. This realization builds a quiet but powerful momentum toward decisive action, even if that action comes at significant cost. Such a turning point is rarely impulsive. It is usually the result of accumulated frustrations, unfulfilled promises, and repeated experiences of being placed in a disadvantageous position. Economic dependency, unfair trade practices, or attempts to dictate internal policies from the outside can initially be tolerated in the interest of maintaining harmony. But over time, these pressures chip away at the sense of control a nation holds over its own destiny. When that sense of control is sufficiently threatened, the desire to reclaim autonomy becomes stronger than the fear of potential consequences. In that moment, a nation may decide that the short-term pain of confrontation is preferable to the long-term erosion of its independence. This phenomenon is not limited to military or political conflicts. It applies equally to economic and humanitarian issues. A country dependent on a particular resource or market might endure certain unfavorable conditions for years that, believing cooperation will eventually lead to fair treatment. But if the imbalance persists, that what was once considered pragmatic patience can transform into resentment and defiance. The suspension of agreements, the imposition of retaliatory tariffs, or the restriction of essential exports are just a few examples of measures a nation might take to send the message that it will no longer be taken for granted. These actions often serve as both a practical defense and a symbolic assertion of sovereignty. That public sentiment plays a crucial role in this shift from endurance to resistance. That citizens who feel exploited or disrespected by foreign powers exert pressure on their leaders to take a stand. In democratic nations, this can manifest in electoral shifts, policy changes, and rallies for greater independence. In more centralized governments, it can lead to strategic realignments or bold unilateral actions. The underlying principle remains the same: a nation's tolerance has limits. And once crossed, the response can be swift, resolute, and unapologetic. The moment a country decides it has been pushed too far is a pivotal one. Not only for its own future, but for the global order. Such a decision often reverberates beyond borders, altering alliances, trade routes, and diplomatic norms. It serves as a reminder that even in a world bound by interdependence, sovereignty is a line that, once tested too harshly, can provoke actions that reshape relationships for years to come. Self-reliance and dignity are deeply intertwined principles that guide the actions of nations as much as they guide individuals. For a country, self-reliance means the ability to meet its essential needs without being overly dependent on foreign powers, particularly in areas that directly affect the survival, security, and well-being of its people. This does not imply isolation or the complete rejection of international cooperation. Rather, it is about having the internal capacity to produce, innovate, and respond to challenges without being held hostage to the will or conditions of others. When a nation can sustain its economy, feed its population, and provide critical goods such as medicines, technology, and energy from its own resources, it enjoys a strategic freedom that enables it to act in accordance with its own values and long-term interests. Dignity in this context goes beyond national pride. It is about preserving a sense of respect and fairness in international dealings. A nation that depends too heavily on others for its most vital needs risks being treated as a subordinate partner in negotiations. Over time, this imbalance can erode the mutual respect that underpins healthy diplomatic relationships. By strengthening self-reliance, a nation reinforces its dignity, ensuring that it engages with others from a position of equality rather than desperation. This allows it to protect its cultural identity, defend its political sovereignty, and make decisions without fear of coercion. In practical terms, self-reliance is often achieved through strategic investments in domestic industries, infrastructure, education, and innovation. It involves nurturing the capacity to produce essential goods, developing resilient supply chains, and maintaining a skilled workforce. For many nations, this also means reducing vulnerabilities by diversifying energy sources, securing food supplies, and fostering technological independence. When these foundations are strong, a nation can withstand external pressures, whether they come in the form of economic sanctions, trade restrictions, or shifts in global markets, without compromising its dignity. However, self-reliance is not solely about material resources. It is also about mindset. A nation's confidence in its ability to shape its own destiny is as important as the tangible assets it possesses. that when leaders and citizens believe in their collective capacity to overcome challenges through their own efforts, that they project a form of dignity that commands respect internationally. That this psychological resilience is often what enables nations to resist undue influence, even from more powerful counterparts. In moments of crisis, that self-reliance and dignity become even more critical. Whether facing a pandemic, a financial collapse, or geopolitical pressure, that the ability to rely on internal strengths allows a nation to respond decisively rather than react out of necessity. That such a stance does not mean rejecting global collaboration, but engaging in it from a place of choice rather than obligation. That this combination of independence and self-respect forms the backbone of true sovereignty. That ensuring that a nation's actions are guided by its own principles and priorities rather than dictated by external forces. That true power is sometimes shown in quiet resistance because strength is not always about loud declarations, visible confrontations, or dramatic displays. In many cases, the most profound influence is exerted through calm, deliberate, and unwavering actions that send a message without the need for shouting. That quiet resistance operates on the principle that control over one's decisions, resources, and boundaries is itself a form of authority. That it is the refusal to be coerced, the choice to withhold cooperation, or the decision to act in one's own interest regardless of external pressure. That such resistance often speaks louder than open defiance because it is rooted in confidence and strategic patience rather than emotional reaction. That in the realm of international relations, quiet resistance can take the form of policy changes, economic measures, or shifts in alliances that subtly but decisively alter the balance of power. A country might halt the export of a critical resource, delay a key negotiation, or quietly invest in alternative partnerships while maintaining a public posture of diplomacy. That the absence of direct confrontation often disarms opponents, making it harder for them to justify retaliation without appearing unreasonable. That this kind of calculated restraint allows a nation to protect its interests while avoiding the escalation that open conflict might bring. That the power of quiet resistance lies in its ability to unsettle without overt provocation. When a nation or leader remains composed under pressure, refusing to yield, yet not engaging in aggressive posturing, it projects an image of control that is often more intimidating than overt hostility. That this is because it signals that decisions are not being made out of fear or impulse, but out of deliberate choice. That the opposing side is forced to confront the reality that their usual tools of persuasion, threats, incentives, or public shaming may have little to no effect. History offers many examples where silent defiance reshaped outcomes. That movements that withheld cooperation, leaders who declined to sign unfair agreements, or countries that quietly developed alternatives to dependency all demonstrated that endurance can be as impactful as confrontation. Such actions disrupt expectations, forcing others to rethink strategies and sometimes leading to concessions without a single public victory being claimed. Quiet resistance also carries a moral weight. By avoiding open aggression, it minimizes collateral damage while still affirming autonomy. It shows that strength can be exercised responsibly, that the ultimate goal is not to dominate, but to preserve dignity and self-determination. This form of power tends to earn long-term respect, even from adversaries, because it reflects discipline, vision, and a deep understanding of the bigger picture. In a world that often equates influence with volume and visibility, quiet resistance is a reminder that true authority comes from within. that. The ability to hold one's position without fanfare or force is not a sign of weakness, but of mastery. That. It is the art of making a statement without speaking, of winning without fighting. That. And of showing that the deepest form of power is the one that does not need to announce itself to be felt.